I will introduce myself a bit further. I'm Cis Vrijmoeth. I work as a researcher for 2 mental health care organizations. And in that role, I support clinicians who do research. And I support them in their research, and I introduce them into the world of research and methods and data analysis. For this presentation, I will focus on a study of one of my colleagues, Janneke Hoeksema. She is not here right now, but I will use this research to tell you something about the method we used. She has done research into adolescents, and she developed a workbook called Ik kan het aan geloven in je herstel in het Nederlands. In English it's I can manage believing in recovery. It was an intervention in addition to cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's, well, I will tell you something about our study, and I will use it to answer a question. The question: is a single case experimental design an interesting method for longitudinal research over time? So, in the end, if you have formed an opinion about this question, I've done well. And Janneke developed a workbook. And the workbook was aimed at enhancing positive religious coping and enhancing existential and clinical recovery in adolescents, and specifically in adolescents with anxiety problems. So, first, something about the workbook. I have a hard copy here. I will give it to you so you can give it to the others. You can look for yourself. It's a workbook. It's developed to integrate with therapy, with cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's about themes that are usually in CBT, like feelings and emotions, like helping thoughts, destructive thoughts. Here's a list of the themes that are in the workbook, and you can see it for yourself if you can read that, if you can read Dutch. And she developed the workbook because at Elios there are a number of people who are willing to integrate their faith, their religious belief and experiences into therapy. But and we know it may help them in their recovery. But for adolescents at that time there was nothing yet available to integrate with therapy, and that's why she developed the workbook. An example is psychoeducation about feelings and emotions. That's part of creation, also the more positive ones, the negative ones, and also practice to voice your feelings in prayer to God. That's an example. She also included self-compassion. Self-compassion is a relatively new construct, and I think it's interesting. She also included a chapter about that. So now about the design. We used a single case experimental design to evaluate the effectiveness, whether or not it increases religious coping and it increased clinical recovery and existential recovery. A single case experimental design refers to a single case, which can mean a person, but it can also mean a small group of persons. In this case, we used a group of adolescents with anxiety problems. And experimental refers to the different phases. Normally, you have in a single case experimental design a baseline phase. So people act as their own control, as their own reference. That's an advantage. But normally, in a clinical trial, you have an experimental group and a control group. But here there are controls. The people are the controls themselves. And in each phase, you have a number of measurements, because you need at least 3 or 4, perhaps 5 measurements in each phase. And the experimental refers to the treatment, often refers to the intervention, the phase in which you provide an intervention. In this case, it was the CBT alongside with the workbook. We followed these adolescents for 4 weeks. We had 4 weekly measurements. Normally you want repeated measurements. You can do it every week, you can do it every day, you can do it every hour, you can do it every month. And in the treatment phase, there were 12 sessions of CBT alongside with the workbook, and they were followed for, or were also followed for every week. Normally, what you do in a trial, in a group design, you have a pre and a post. You at least have a pre and a post measurement. You can also include it in a single case experimental design, but the main focus is on the weekly measurements. What we did include, we combined the group design with a single case experimental design. It's not necessary for the design itself. The group who received the CBT with the workbook is interesting in itself, but you can control it with a control group. In this case, we had participants receiving only the CBT. You need to think about the participants. In our case, we had 29 eligible participants. However, there were a number of eligible participants excluded because of comorbid conditions, or because after intake the therapy was changed. It was not CBT anymore, but another form was provided. And during and after, we encountered some problems because of the start of the COVID crisis. However, in the single case experimental design, it's not so much a problem, as each case is also their own control. So we only had 6 people that were divided among both groups, and it's a little bit low, but there are but also these 3 cases were interesting. In a single case experimental design, you want to think about your measures, because you ask participants to fill in questionnaires, but a lot of times. So you think about measures that are not experienced to be a burden, but you also want the measures you want the measures to have some variation, because otherwise you don't measure the expected effectiveness in this case. In this case, we used weekly measures, and we had 3 domains for the measures, and the number of items was relatively low, but we had 5 items for positive religious coping, and we had a number of items for existential recovery. And we focused on hope, religious well-being, and the experienced empowerment or control. And for clinical recovery, we focused on 3 anxiety symptoms. Okay. With regard to the data analysis, there are a number of things you can do. What you normally do is you look visually at the weekly measurement, at the repeat measurements. That's the main focus. There are some simple techniques. You can use an index of non-overlap of scores and phase, but you can also use mixed models to analyze the mean scores of the participants in the different groups. And you can also look at the pre-post measures, but then statistical analysis is more difficult, and then you often use reliable change index scores. So here's an example of the results in the group. On the left-hand side, you see the figure, and you can look at the trend of the line. In this case, you see a trend in the treatment phase towards more positive religious coping, and it's different for the different participants. On the right-hand side, you see the difference with the mean scores. Over time, all these people, all these adolescents, they increased in religious coping. However, I think the effect was relatively, it was medium. Here are the results of the pre and post scores. And as you can see, you can use the reliable change index scores, and it gives you an idea of the whether or not the differences between the pre and the post was clinically significant. In this case, for the experiment, experimental group, the results were clinically significant. Only for Ellen in the middle, her total SDQ, strength and difficulties questionnaires, did not decrease enough to be clinical significant, but there was a decrease. So is the workbook effective? I think you can also, in this experimental design, you can also use qualitative data, notes of therapists, for example. I think it's safe to say it's applicable to religious use. We saw more positive religious coping and more existential and clinical recovery. However, a comparison with the control group was still difficult, so we can't say it's better than regular therapy. To sum up, is a single case experimental design an interesting method for longitudinal research? Yes, it's flexible. You can have different phases. You can have an A-B design. You can have an A-B-C design. You can have a period of follow-up. You can have another period of no therapy. You can look at 2 phases of different therapies. So it's flexible. Another advantage is the number of participants. You don't have to worry about power, as each participant is on control. You can analyze it on individual level and on a group level. Using more advanced statistical methods, it's possible to look at it on a group level. It gives you in-depth information of the process. We saw the table and with the mean scores, and the mean scores are just the mean scores. And it's interesting that in the figure you see the process, and you can look at the weeks and what happened in that week. And if you have enough information about what happened during that session, is the qualitative data, the notes of the therapist, you can combine that information. So that's nice. This is my last sheet. I think it's an interesting design. It has some advantages. There are also some challenges. You need to have the right measure. And one of our participants, the anxiety symptoms were not the symptoms she experienced. So you might want to think about personalized measures that are personal for each participant. In the control group, there were also some circumstances that did stagnate the therapy. So we didn't, we weren't able to see, how do you say it? We weren't able to look at the effectiveness of the treatment anymore in those patients. And another challenge is the administration of the process. It's time consuming. It's you don't need much people, but you have to follow them more intensely. And there are some privacy considerations. You know much about the people you follow, and you need to know what you write down in your paper and whatnot.
Okay. Thank you, Cis, for this presentation. I can imagine that there is a question.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How do you define existential recovery? Did you mention it too? Perhaps I missed it.
Yeah, but we looked at hope, religious.
Yes, I see it. There's a question about the existential recovery and how did you measure it?
We looked at religious well-being, whether or not a person feels alone and feels that God is with them. We looked at hope, and we looked at empowerment. That was how we measured existential recovery. So it's
not an existing skill.
It's not an we used items from existing skills. Yes. We combined them, but the internal consistency of the skill of the total skill was okay. However, it's still a combination of items.
The selection of
the selection of them, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, another question on this topic?
Maybe a bit detailed, but I think dropout as a result of circumstances happens in many studies in in clinical
Mhm.
practice? Is it the effect of this different than in a more traditional study?
Yes, there's a question about dropout. Is the effect of circumstances leading to dropout different in a SCAT design than in other designs?
No, I don't think it is. It depends on the reasons for dropout.
Yeah.
If the reasons for dropout are related to your treatment, it says something about your treatment. But if it's related to more practical reasons,
It's not because the method is quite intensive for persons participate.
maybe.
Yes, but the most participants who dropped out had reasons for a change in therapy, for example, and that was not related to the methodology of the study.
Yeah, we didn't find. There were maybe one or two for which the therapy was too intense. The whole study was too intense. Yeah.